All right, we're going to get started. Today's Monday, the 21st, so according to the revised schedule we did, we're going to go through some DOM examples today, so I'm going to go through some stuff with you. Let me tell you that I'm going to do the best I can to make sure that on your next test, what you have to do with the DOM is going to be as minimal as possible. All right? And you know that one of the things that we did in class was I showed you 2 or 3 copies of that MPG program, if you remember that miles per gallon program. And with the last copy of the miles per gallon program, what we did was we actually added some stuff where, if you remember, we had required fields, and if you didn't put it in, it put a message right off to the side, etc. You're going to have to do something similar to that. So I would suggest that you take a look at that program before the test, which is next week, all right? Or have your hard copy with you, or both, all right? Part of the problem with this is, I mean, let's face it, you got 80 days, and you probably have a good 200 days worth of material to learn. There's just I'm not saying way too much, but there's just a lot of stuff that you have to learn. And whether or not you're able to learn it all, I'm able to teach it all, doesn't really matter in the end. All right, because like I said, there's just a lot of stuff to learn. Now, you don't have to open this, but just so you know, what I sent you this morning was another folder called DOM exercises. Now, what's in it, just so you see this, some of this you already had. All right, but I just want you to see what's in it. I went back over yesterday these 2 articles, JavaScript and the DOM series, lesson 1 and lesson 2. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time walking through those with you in just a couple minutes. All right? And then I went through the examples that were on W3 Schools, and there's 20 of them. I had put them in a document, so what I did was I broke them out into 20 different things, as you can see right here. These are taken right from W3 Schools. You could also make a case here that, wow, they're not really written very well, because, for instance, if you take a look here, I'm just going to open up the first one just to show you. Notice there's no head. It's just a very simple body, and virtually every one of them is set up like this. Where it's got the paragraph, the text in there is different, but it's got a button, my function, and then this is what they change every time. So I want to go over a couple of those with you. I'm not going to go over all 20. I mean, let's be real here. But I think that we can go over this stuff in around an hour. And then you'll have the rest of the class period to work on your homework for Chapter 5. Now, a couple of you got a hold of me this weekend and said, hey, I'm having a lot of problems with the exercise that's in Chapter 5. My suggestion, and I've talked to a couple people separately about this, is that, I'm just going to mention his name here. One of the things that Ethan does, and I think it's a good thing, is when he does the assignment, he breaks it up into the different sections, and he sends me all those sections. So if there's 5 parts, you've got 5 different things. And I think that's the best way to do it. What a lot of you appear to be doing is you'll get through section 1, it'll work fine, you'll just keep adding on to that document for section 2, that'll be fine, but then you get to a certain point where it breaks. I think you're much better off doing it a section at a time, making a copy of what works and going on. Is that more work? Yes. All right. But I will tell you that there is going to be an amount of the DOM that you're going to have to understand if you want to do this for a living. All right. You'll have to be able to, and let's face it, it's not very often that you're going to come in there and you're going to literally be changing what's on a web page while the user is running it, because that might confuse them. And if you make something too hard for a user, typically they'll leave your site, and you wouldn't usually want to do that. All right? But again, even something as simple as this, just so you see this, and I may have shown you this before, it's not a big thing, you probably have seen stuff like this before, but I go out to Amazon, all right? And I've been trying for years to teach myself to play guitar, and I'm just a moron when it comes to trying to learn, okay? So my wife bought me a really nice guitar and said, I want you to learn this. Okay, so I'm starting to try. So that's why you see these books here. But the point is, what happens? I go and I look at a book, and the system immediately says, oh, look what you've got there. I'm going to suggest these other books also. And why are they going to do that? That's good business, right? All right, now that's not just the DOM that does that. All right, it also has to do with something that's referred to as cookies, which you may or may not have heard of before. And a cookie is basically a very simple, small little text file that a server writes to your machine that has things in it like preferences, etc. They're not, there's all sorts of files or posts and stuff that you can see out online that says cookies are evil. They're not evil. They're not executable files. They're text files. You can only typically have a certain number of them on your system, but they work in conjunction with the DOM because this is good business, isn't it? If they think, well, he's interested in this one, maybe he didn't buy this book, but maybe he'd like to see these. So the system needs some way, and doing stuff like that makes sense. Now, again, I was going out there and I look at IT books all the time. All right, and one of the things I looked at, and it wasn't too long ago, was things on App Inventor, which is a stripped down version of being able to write apps in Android. So for the next umpteen amount of time, I was getting stuff like this all the time. Because again, that makes sense. So doing stuff like that makes sense. I've given you examples before too where, if you wanted to do this, if a user came onto your site, you wanted to ask them something like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite font? You could go and you could set the site up like that if you wanted to do that. All right? That's actually quite a bit more work than you'd probably think to maintain that and to do it well. All right? But the idea is there is at least a certain amount of stuff that you're going to end up doing. It's not the one I want to show you. That you're going to end up doing when you do this stuff. All right, so what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to literally, because it's 8:13, and like I said, I want to be done with this by 9 o'clock, so you have plenty of time to sit there and do your work. All right, remember, tomorrow when you come in here, first thing that happens when you come in is you'll take your written test. All right, so that'll be the first thing. And after you take the written test, we'll probably start at around 9. We'll go over Chapter 6. All right? So for the test, for the hands-on test, it's next week. You can see it's next week on the 30th. So it's more than a week away. What you'll have, again, for Chapter 5 is you'll have to take either the BMI or some kind of a program like that, and you'll have to massage it where you'll basically set it up as an HTML form, and you'll add the code to it so that if the user puts in values that are non-numeric, you'll give them a message off to the side that says that. If they're out of range, you'll give them a message out of the side that says, you get what I'm saying? So that's what you're going to have basically for this chapter. All right. Then when we get into the next chapter, which is tomorrow already, that's on forms. Now, I've said this to you before. I don't feel the need tomorrow to sit there and say, this is how you build an HTML form. You've done that already. So what we're going to concentrate solely on is using JavaScript to validate a form. All right. And what you will do for your test then next week is you will have to create some kind of a form, and you will be validating that form using JavaScript. You could turn around and say, well, I could do a lot of this stuff that you're having me do. I could just do it with HTML. I don't care. That's not what you're going to be assigned to do. Remember, some users could have older browsers that don't support HTML5. So you have to make sure that it's JavaScript. Use JavaScript, and you can validate it that way. All right. So we'll go through Chapter 6 tomorrow. Then we will go through the test review, which is TR, and then Wednesday, which is our last day this week, we'll go through some examples of forms. All right? Okay. So this thing, I thought this was very well written. All right? The guy doesn't think he does a very good job when he writes, But he talks about some stuff, and again, some of the stuff I'll go over right now, review. All right? He talks about this being a dynamic programming language. So the idea is when you run your website, when you run your web page, whatever it is you're working on, you're able to change it while the program's running. That's the first thing he talks about. He mentions loosely typed. We've already talked about loosely typed, so I'm not going to go over it with you again. This thing that's called prototypes, we'll look at this in the next chapter. Again, I may have said this to you before, I may not have. To me, Chapter 5 and Chapter 7 are the hardest part of this class, period. All right, Chapter 5, which is on the DOM, and Chapter 7, which is on object-oriented JavaScript. They're the hardest part. All right? So he talks about the document object model, and he says, here's an example. And if you look at it, you go, well, that's not the way it looked. Well, if you tilted it on its end, that's pretty much the way it would look as far as what we looked at last week. All right? So he says here a few noteworthy things about the DOM. And I think this stuff is important. All right? When you work with this, it's document object model. Chapter 7 is on object-oriented JavaScript. So we'll look more at objects. Objects are things that have two types of things to it. They have properties and they have methods. You already know some of this stuff. All right? You have set up CSS forms, for example, that have properties, things like a text color, a background color, a font size, etc. You know how to do that kind of stuff. All right? We've also looked a little bit, we're going to look more at this also pretty quick, about being able to do things like make sure that when the form comes up that your cursor is in a certain field. That's a method that does that. That's called a focus method. So properties are things that are associated with something. Like with you all have a height, you all have a weight, an eye color, a hair color, a gender, etc. Those would be properties. You all do certain things that are the same. You all eat, you all drink, you all sleep. Those would be methods. All right? So that's what they're talking about in here. All right. So he explains what those are, and then he mentions this thing is a hierarchy. We've talked about that a little bit. And it goes down. All right, at the top of the hierarchy is HTML, because it's the only thing that has no parent. And everything down below that can be both a child and it can be a parent at the same time. That's not a problem. When you get down to the bottom, you've got things that are called leaf nodes that don't have any children. All right? And the whole thing about the document object model is basically the stuff that's right here. The document object model consists of elements. All right, so for instance, if I've got a paragraph tag, all right, let's say I've got a div, and that div has got a paragraph in it, and that paragraph has got text in it. All right, then I have a div element, I have a paragraph element, and I have a text element. And that text element actually is going to hold that text. And that's what they're talking about in here. And again, it's that whole idea that we mentioned before, the whole thing where as long as you give stuff IDs, you're able to manipulate it programmatically. That's what the DOM is all about. So what I did was I went through all the text that the author has, or all the code the author has in here, and all the code the author has in the next chapter. And it's interesting, there's probably about 20 or 30 things, and I got all of them to work except the last one. All right, which I think is pretty good. Now, one of the things that the author talks about is this right here, which we may or may not have even talked about before. But if you do that C data that's in there, all that's for is for older versions of browsers. All right, and and if you say, do I really need that stuff in there? Well, if you decide you're going to put your JavaScript code inline, so right inside of your HTML file, you should always put that in. Because what happens is if somebody has a really old version of a browser and they don't understand JavaScript or what it is you're trying to do, what happens is without that is it takes the actual code and it puts it on the web page, which typically isn't going to be what you want to have happen. So do you need this? The answer is no. If you take all of your JavaScript and put it in an external JS file like we've been doing, you don't even need to use this. All right? But he explains in here exactly why you use it, what you do about it, etc. All right? And again, these are the kind of things. If you go in for a job, be it a full-time job or an internship or whatever, you may be asked stuff like this. All right? Everyone's different as far as what they expect you to know and what they consider as important. And then he talks about different types of variables, what a numeric variable is, what a string is, what a Boolean is. I just skip that stuff. I'm going to just jump way down. This is what we're going to get into in Chapter 7, just so you know. So when you create something like this, we're used to doing kind of stuff like this. We didn't look at it in a lot of detail, but when you look at an array, that's what's called an associative array. So instead of saying element 0 is Bob, element 1 is 99, element 2 is freelance hitman, all right, you say element name is Bob, element age is 99, element job is freelance hitman, all right? Well, that's fine. But another way you can do that is like this, all right? You say var profile equal, notice you say object and you say parentheses. Then it's the name of the object, which is profile dot the name of the property. So there's a name property, an age property, and a job property there. All right? So this is another way of writing. There are books that I've used before for teaching a class like this, which virtually don't talk about object-oriented JavaScript at all. There are other books that are just totally on object-oriented JavaScript, and they don't even go over the other type that we've been going over. Most books are somewhere in between. All right, then he talks about if, else, equality, looping. You know all that stuff already. Then he said, good, now let's get back to the DOM. All right? So again, notice what he's doing in here. Very simple stuff. He's saying, we're going to put a paragraph in here. It's got an ID of intro, so we can manipulate it. And all it has in here is my first paragraph. All right? Then we've got an unordered list. And if you look, this unordered list does not have an ID. So, gee, how can we manipulate it? All right, well, we can manipulate it by basically just using UL. Remember, there's a get element by ID, and then there's a get elements by tag name. All right, so if you decide you're not going to use IDs, this is another way you can do the manipulation. And that's what the author talks about in here. All right, so really when you create this, it's very simple. It's got that paragraph that just has that text in it, and it's got a simple unordered list. That's what he has. I changed them to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 just so they look a little different. All right? And then he says, well, why would you even want to use this? And he says this. Whoops. So what is this? Var intro paragraph equal document.get element by ID intro. He's saying, grab that paragraph, right? Because there's the ID. So now we've got a variable that we can use that's called intro paragraph to do whatever it is we might want to do. All right, he'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Then he says, well, what about doing the same kind of thing with our unordered list? Well, with our paragraph, we use get element by ID, element, and with our unordered list, it was get elements by tag name. So that said, give us all the unordered lists. There's only one in here, so it made it much easier. He talks a little bit about get element by ID. He talks a little bit about get elements by tag name. All right? Then he says when you do this, okay, if we look in here, if we wanted to use the first element, so it says access single unordered list, all right? But this is where the power is right there. Now I'm saying I want to go in there and I want to be able to grab all the list items. What that does with this all list items is it brings you back an array with everything that's in there. All right? And then you cycle through it, and what ends up happening, I can show you this if you care. That's not it. Yeah, there it is. See how it just cycles through and it says list item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, this is what he has you build throughout here. All right, and we're going to go over some of the rest of that in just a minute. But what I liked about this article is he starts to show you with pictures and like exactly what's happening as you're working your way through here. All right. When you go through this, again, it's referred to as traversing the DOM. Some books call it walking the DOM. And remember, the DOM is made up, everything that you saw at the beginning when we showed that color picture, all right, those are nodes. And notice these all start with node dot something. So you can add nodes, you can modify existing nodes, you can delete existing nodes. And when you add nodes, you've got your choice over where you add them. You can add them at the end or you can add them anywhere in the middle. And that's what they talk about in here. All right. And again, he shows you the same kind of thing in here as far as what's going on. Now, I did want to mention, you may or may not care, at the end of this article, he talks about this, and I tried to link to a couple of these. Didn't work, so I added this one. And I just want you to see this. Again, you may not care, and that's fine. But this guy, just want you to see him. His name is Douglas Crockford. And basically, he's one of the fathers of JavaScript. All right, he's got all sorts of books out there. He's got classes out there that you can take, etc. But the reason I'm telling you that is after you finish this class, let's say it's summer, and you know you do want to go out and you want to start working on some websites on your own or whatever, and you forget some JavaScript or whatever. He's a really good place to start. This presentation that he has right here, it's almost 2 hours long. I watched part of it this morning. But he goes through a little bit of the history of the language, but then he talks about what the language is all about. And he dispels a lot of myths that people have about the language. Well, people think JavaScript is this. Well, it's not. And that's what the whole thing is on. And like I said, I thought at least it's pretty good. All right. Now, the second part of this series, this is all on the DOM. So he goes through how to manipulate. This is a kind of an important thing right here. It's important that you understand what's happening in here, in the gray. Did you all notice? He came in and fixed it, and supposedly it's a lot better focus right now. Right. The bad thing is, and according to Charles, I might have to download a new driver on here because this morning it kept turning on and off. It just would pop. And it actually started to make some noise when it did it, which I didn't like. All right, so this is your entire document. All right, so we've got something called document. All right, this is my document dot get element by ID intro. So that's that paragraph that we saw before that just said a simple paragraph or whatever the heck it was. Do you have to do this? No, we could have left that variable out and just said document.getElementById intro. The author breaks it down into steps to try to make it easier for you to understand. All right. Then he creates a style. All right. And he says this style, you all should know this by now, is it says I want a red text color. All right. Then he comes in on the next page and he says let's have some other styles. So let's add padding, let's add background color, let's add margin, etc. And he talks about how you can do all this stuff. All right. The key thing is what he's getting to is that. This is one way that you can do things. Document.getElementID. So give me that paragraph. To that paragraph, I want to add a style. What style? The color. What color? I want it to be red. So in one line of code, that's a way you can take that paragraph and make it red. The problem is, what if you want to do about 10 things? Right? You could put 10 lines in there like that, and it would work. You could get it to work. But the author says if you don't want to do that, then what you could do is you could literally go in and write yourself a little routine where you could pass in as many things in there as you wanted, and they show an example here, all right, to try to make it easier for yourself. Okay? I do want to mention, just so you see this, and I said this the other day, but I'm saying it again. That's erroneous in JavaScript because it thinks that it's a mathematical operation. This is on your test for tomorrow. So make sure that you use camel casing when you work with CSS properties inside of JavaScript. So that shouldn't be padding dash top. That should be padding, and then instead of looking like this, it should look like this. Oops. Come on. It should look like padding top, like that. And if you remember that, that's one of the questions on the test. All right. So he goes through here and he says, you can go in, and if you didn't know this before, we've looked at this kind of stuff before. You know, I told you how you could hit F12 and it'll bring all that up, etc. Well, another thing you can do is you can, like, if I wanted to know about this particular thing right here, I could right mouse click on this and choose right mouse click and choose inspect. And that'll bring that up. But what that's bringing up in here is everything that built this. The reason that's kind of neat is sometimes you go out to somebody else's website and you're like, wow, that's really cool the way they use the color and they use this and they use that. You can look at that. And I'm not saying go out there and rip off other people's code. I don't mean to say that at all. But sometimes to get an idea of how somebody did something, that can help. All right. So he goes through and he says, if we want, he uses the inner HTML to add more content to this. So again, you may or may not have noticed when I did this before. Of course, I don't have it. But what happens is originally it says, it just said something like this is a paragraph. Then he comes in and he changes it by adding things using the inner HTML. All right? And then he explains after that, he said, although you can do that, a lot of people don't like using inner HTML because it's not an official part of the DOM spec. But that said, people do it anyway. If you don't want to do it that way, then he shows you how to do it with create text node. So he's showing you all the major ways that you run through and you add information to the DOM. All right? And he talks about, you set up your text node, you do an append, and by default it'll stick it onto the bottom or at the end of it. So what does he put here? This is the text I want to add. All right, so this is the text I want to add. That's what he added right there in the blue. All right, and in that case, when he added it using basically a create text node. All right, again, not the only way of doing it, but a way of doing it, and a way that you're going to see that people use. All right. Then he talks about event handling. I mentioned this last week, how basically the system is sitting there waiting for you to do something so it can react to it. All right? And that's what they talk about in here. Now, this is maybe the most important part of this. You don't have to memorize these, but these are all the different places where you can potentially add code. Mouse up, mouse down, etc. Key up, key down, select different form elements, the load, the unload, etc. This site right here, I actually gave you that one. This is actually pretty good. This is under the Mozilla Developer Network, and they talk to you about places where you can add code, and if you click on these, they're all hyperlinked, and they all have examples. All right. You've seen this kind of stuff before. He sets this up where he says you just click the button. I don't want to run this again, but if I click on the button, it just comes up and it just brings you an alert up that says you click the button. All right, and this is what I showed you when we went through that last MPG one, miles per gallon one. If you remember, this right here, this line, that's registering that function. This says when I click the thing that's called my element, run the routine that's called button click. All right, we don't put the parens there because that's doing a regular registration. So that says whenever I click that, whatever that happens to be, call that routine that just says you just click the button. You'll have to know that on your test next week because you will do something like that. Then he says there's an advanced way of doing that. All right, and he goes through, and the problem with that is Microsoft does it one way and everybody else does it another way. I'm not going to run through that with you, but he goes through it in some depth and breadth of coverage, much better than I could. All right. Then he talks about this event object. As it says, whenever you bind a function to an event, whenever you create an event handler, the function will be passed as an object. Remember, one of the things that you're able to do in JavaScript is you can use functions as though they're variables. That's why you can say var function equals, or var function with a name equals. If you just say var function equals, that's an anonymous function. If I say var function and give it a name and I say equals, all right, now whatever happens in that function, all the code that's in there is all going to be basically stuck into the function itself. So you are using the function as though it's a variable. And again, he runs through this idea of something that's called bubbling up. Again, you have to know it. It's something you should at least be familiar with. So what the author says is in here, you've got this hypertext, you got a hyperlink. So first what happens is the hyperlink fires. The hyperlink is inside of the paragraph. So then the paragraph fires. The paragraph is inside of a div. So then the div fires. The div is inside of the body. So then the body fires. And you go, what does that mean that fires? That means that if you have any code that's associated with this, and you click on the hyperlink, first any code associated with a hyperlink will fire, then the code that's associated with the paragraph will fire, then the code that's associated with the div will fire, and finally the code that is associated with the body will fire. All right, and that's what he gets to in here. That's his illustration of what's called bubbling. All right, so that's it for that one. Just to show you again real quick. Now, so what's in here? Those two articles that I just showed you, all right, the URL which I just showed you, then this W3 Schools, this Toots Plus, that's the one that's got all of the code for these articles. So I've shown you that. So if we look here under W3 Schools, there are 20 examples, and if I go out here and I type in right here, and I go DOM tutorial, W3 Schools. All right. And it says here, there's my tutorial. And I go through, there's some stuff, what will you learn, etc., etc. Go to the next page. All right. It shows you some examples. You go to the next page, and you can see it's starting to show you more examples that are in here, some more stuff that's in here. You go to the next page. Sooner or later, what you get to in here is there are a bunch of examples. There are literally about 20 examples. That's what you have in here. All right? So those are the examples. A lot of them, they're big deal. All right? Who cares? But a lot of them are kind of neat because they show you different things that are in there. All right? Click the button to display the referrer of the document. Well, you click and nothing happens. What does that mean? That means there is no referrer. There's none of that in there. All right, so some of them don't do a thing. Click it to open up a new window and add some content. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close everything except for this window. Would you agree that the only window open right now is this one right here? All right, notice what happens. You notice how a second window opened. So they're showing you in here, All right, how you can manipulate and how you can have one window open up another window. So for instance, if you had a hyperlink on your website that said, click here to see today's special or today's specials or whatever, you could have that come up in another window. All right. So like I said, there's about 20 examples of different kinds of complexity. Click the button to show the inner HTML of the first anchor element. Well, there's the inner HTML right there. So notice when I click what happens. It just shows me that. All right. The author showed you all of these. These literally could end up being hyperlinks or whatever, but then he's saying, show me the first one. And there's a lot of stuff that he does in here with showing the first of something, showing the last of something. And when you look at it again, there's not really much in it. They're all really, really small examples. So he's basically just saying, show me that. All right? And he runs through how to use all these. So like I said, there's 20 examples of those. Finally, when I taught at the school I used to be at, one of the books that we used, it had a chapter on the DOM. And I was looking for something else yesterday, and I found a bunch of exercises it had, some of which I changed around, etc. But I just wanted to show you a couple of these things that are in here. It's not the one. All right. So this is some kind of a slideshow. And you'll notice when you start working your way through it, for some reason it tends to take a while to get going. But it'll go through an actual slideshow. So this is an example of building a slideshow using JavaScript. Now, do you have to build a slideshow using JavaScript? No. You can typically use like carousels that are available to you from like jQuery and only add a line or two of code and do this same thing. And if you don't know JavaScript and you don't know jQuery, it is possible for you to actually create a carousel using just CSS and HTML. So there's a lot of different ways that this stuff can be done. So what I have in there are about 20 more examples. All right. But like I said, I literally sat down yesterday and probably spent 3 or 4 hours going through this. And I thought this is getting kind of ridiculous for the instructor too, because I'm spending 3 or 4 hours and then I'm spending an hour talking to you about it. All right. And it seems like I'm putting in a hell of a lot of work, and I don't even know if you're going to go back and look at these. But I would strongly suggest that you do, and you have this information available to you so that next week when you take the test, I've already shown you now. You already know what's going to be on the test for Chapter 5. I'll take your question in a second. So you already know that, right? And tomorrow, after tomorrow, and Wednesday, you'll pretty much know what's going to be on there for Chapter 6. And then next Monday will be lab. Tuesday will be the written. Wednesday will be the hands-on. So Thursday and Friday, we'll finish up Chapter 7. The next week, we'll finish up Chapter 8. We'll have the hands-on. And if we can keep that schedule, that'll mean you'll have 7 periods. That's 28 hours approximately to work on that portfolio. So even if you've done nothing to it since you worked on it earlier, you should still be able to go back. And again, much of this grade is going to be based on how professional it is. I went back and I rewrote the grade schedule for it yesterday. I didn't like it. So I'm going to go back and rewrite it again. I've got half the test done. You'll get those back first thing tomorrow morning. Sorry about that. Question?
So on the slideshow thing, isn't on the CSS it doesn't automatically do it? It only you have to click a button or something?
By default, yeah. But you can set it up. You can use things, for example, like we just talked about in this last chapter, like setting up intervals. You can tell it every 5 seconds to switch to a new slide. All right. So there's a lot of different ways that it can be done, is what I'm saying. All right. Okay, so again, when you come in here tomorrow morning, the first thing that you're going to be doing is taking the test. All right. Usually, I give you 8 to 8:30, and then around 9 o'clock, we'll start up with a lecture on Chapter 6. Should take approximately an hour to an hour and a half. Then we will go over the test review. Ideally, that'll be around 11, so you'll still have an hour that you can work on that. For Wednesday, I will come up with at least 2 examples creating forms. One of them I'd like us to do as a class, where we'll create a real simple form, but you'll see how to validate it using just JavaScript. Why? Because it'll be very much patterned after what will be on your test next week. All right? Questions? Okay, that's what I had.